Nobody dared Clint Eastwood to do anything. That was the unwritten rule of Hollywood in 1973. You didn't challenge the man who had stared down outlaws on screen and made it look effortless. You didn't push him. You didn't corner him. And you absolutely did not put him on the spot in front of 15 million people. Johnny Carson did it anyway. It happened on a Tuesday night on the Tonight Show stage in Burbank, California. The studio lights were warm. The audience was settled. Everything felt exactly like it always did. Comfortable, controlled, predictable. Carson sat behind his desk with that easy smile that had welcomed America to bedtime for over a decade. Eastwood sat across from him, one leg crossed, completely at ease. Two of the most powerful men in the country, sharing the most watched couch in America. Then Carson leaned forward. He said 4 words that changed the entire temperature of the room. The audience felt it before they understood it. The crew felt it. The cameras kept rolling, but something shifted. The way air shifts before a storm arrives and everything goes quiet. Eastwood's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough. 7 seconds later, nobody in that studio moved. 15 million people watching from their living rooms didn't move either. Because what happened in those 7 seconds was not what anyone expected from the man they thought they knew. But to understand why that moment stopped America cold, we have to go back. Back before the dare. Back before the desk and the cameras and the studio lights. Back to where 2 very different men came from, and what each of them had been hiding from the world for most of their lives. Johnny Carson grew up in Norfolk, Nebraska, where the winters were long and affection was short. His father was a quiet man who kept his feelings behind a locked door that he never opened, not for his wife and not for his son. Johnny learned early that the safest way to connect with people was to make them laugh. Laughter was a handshake that never got too close. He taught himself magic tricks at 12, performed in the living room, and discovered something that would shape the next 60 years of his life. When people were smiling, they didn't ask hard questions. He carried that lesson all the way to the Tonight Show desk. By 1973, Carson was the most powerful host in American television. 15 million people watched him every single night. Guests came to his couch and told him things they had never told anyone else, because his desk had a way of feeling like a private room, even when the whole country was listening. He was the master of the comfortable confession, the man who could open anyone up. But the people who worked closest to him said the same thing. Off stage, Johnny Carson was the loneliest man in the building. Clint Eastwood grew up 3 states away and a world apart. He was a Depression-era child in San Francisco, moving constantly, never settling, never quite belonging to any single place. He worked logging camps and steel furnaces before Hollywood ever knew his name. He built his identity the way you build a wall, one hard layer at a time. By the time Sergio Leone pointed a camera at him in the Italian desert, Eastwood had already decided what kind of man he was going to be in public. Quiet, unshakable, a man who communicated through action and asked nothing in return. But behind that wall, in private, Clint Eastwood played piano, not casually, not as a parlor trick. He played with the seriousness of a man who needed it. Jazz mostly, built on restraint, built on the spaces between the notes rather than the notes themselves. It was the one place where the wall came down completely. Carson had noticed. Nobody else had. Eastwood had been on the Tonight Show before. He knew how it worked. Carson would ask about the film. He would give enough to be interesting, but not enough to be exposed. They would laugh at the right moments. The audience would applaud. He would walk off the same man he walked on. It was a transaction he had performed dozens of times across dozens of interviews, and he was very good at it. That night, he was promoting High Plains Drifter, a dark film, a film about a man with no name and no past who rode into a town and burned it to the ground. It suited him. It asked nothing personal. He settled into the chair across from Carson and prepared to do what he always did. Carson let him talk for a few minutes. He asked about the film, about the desert locations, about the directing process. Eastwood answered each question the way he answered most questions, directly, briefly, giving the words that were needed and nothing more. The audience laughed when they were supposed to. Everything moved along exactly as planned. Then Carson stopped. He set down his index cards. He leaned back in his chair with that particular smile, not the warm one he used for comedians, but the quieter one, the one that meant he had already decided where the conversation was going, and he was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. "I heard something about you," Carson said. "Something I don't think most people know." Eastwood's expression didn't change, but his right hand, resting on the arm of the chair, went still. "Someone told me you play piano," Carson continued, "and not just picking at it, really play." The audience stirred. A few people laughed, assuming it was a setup for a joke. Eastwood gave a short smile, the kind designed to end a conversation rather than begin one. "I play a little," he said. Carson nodded slowly. He glanced toward the studio piano that lived against the stage wall. Every Tonight Show set had one. Most nights it was invisible. Tonight, Carson looked at it the way a man looks at something he has been thinking about for a while. 30 seconds, Carson said. "That's all. Sit down and play 30 seconds, right now, in front of everybody." The audience went quiet. Eastwood looked at Carson for a long moment. The kind of moment that has weight to it. The kind that people in the room remember long after everything else fades. Then he stood up. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. Clint Eastwood simply stood up from the chair, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the piano. The studio was so quiet that people could hear his footsteps on the stage floor. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. The audience that had been loose and warm 30 seconds earlier had become something else entirely. Still. Waiting. Eastwood pulled out the bench and sat down. He didn't look at the audience. He didn't look at Carson. He looked at the keys, the way a man looks at something deeply familiar. Something he had been alone with for a very long time. He placed his hands in position without rushing. He took one breath. Then he played. It was not a showy thing. It was not a performance designed to impress. It was quiet and low and built from the inside out. A jazz piece, unhurried, melancholic. The kind of music that doesn't ask for your attention but takes it anyway. The notes moved slowly at first, each one landing with space around it. The silences between them carrying just as much weight as the sounds themselves. 7 seconds in, Johnny Carson stopped smiling. It wasn't a dramatic moment. His face didn't fall. His expression didn't shatter. It simply changed, the way a room changes when someone opens a window and real air comes in. Carson had played drums his entire life. He understood music the way a craftsman understands materials. And what he heard in those first 7 seconds was not a man performing. It was a man thinking out loud in the only language where he told the truth. The audience didn't scream. They didn't applaud. They did something rarer and more powerful than either. They went completely silent and stayed there. Eastwood played on. His face remained still, his jaw set, his eyes forward, but his hands moved with a gentleness that had never appeared in any film he had ever made. There was no Dirty Harry in those hands, no man with no name. There was only this, a quiet, private thing that had lived behind the wall for decades, finally breathing open air. Carson watched him the way you watch something you weren't supposed to see. Not with excitement. With recognition. The expression of a man who has just been shown the room behind the door. When the last note faded, the silence stretched. 3 full seconds. 4. Carson made no move to speak. In 30 years of hosting, he had learned that the most powerful thing he could do after a genuine moment was nothing at all. The audience followed his lead without knowing they were following it. Then the applause came, not the sharp, automatic kind that fills a gap, The slow kind. The kind that builds from the back of the room forward, the way a tide comes in. Eastwood lifted his hands from the keys. He turned and looked at Carson for the first time since sitting down. What the audience didn't know, what no one in that studio knew, was that Eastwood had been playing that same piece alone, in private, for nearly 20 years. In his home, in hotel rooms, in the quiet hours before early morning calls on film sets. He had never played it for anyone, until now. The taping ended an hour later. The audience filed out, still talking about it. The crew broke down equipment and exchanged quiet looks the way people do after something unexpected happens in a shared space. The Tonight Show had produced thousands of memorable moments across 11 years. But something about this one felt different. Smaller somehow, more private. Like they had all accidentally walked into a room they weren't meant to enter. Eastwood found Carson backstage before the host had finished removing his microphone. He didn't raise his voice. That was never his way. But the words were direct, and they carried the full weight of a man who did not appreciate surprises. "You had no right to do that," Eastwood said. Carson looked at him steadily. He had expected this. Maybe he had even prepared for it. "Someone had to," Carson said. The silence between them was not comfortable. These were two men who had built entire careers on controlling what the world saw of them, and Carson had just reached past that control in front of 15 million people. Eastwood had every reason to be angry. He stood there and let the feeling move through him without showing it, which was its own kind of answer. "You want to know what I was afraid of?" Eastwood said finally. "Not embarrassment. I've been embarrassed before. I was afraid that if people saw that, the piano, all of it, they'd think less of everything else. That Dirty Harry sits down at a piano and suddenly he's smaller." Carson was quiet for a moment. Then he said something he had rarely said to anyone in 30 years of television. "I know that fear," Carson said. "I've had it my whole life. The fear that if people see the real thing underneath, the rest stops working. That the ordinary man ruins the extraordinary image." He paused. "But you sat down anyway, and nothing got smaller. Everything got larger. Because it was true." Eastwood didn't respond immediately. He stood with that thought the way he stood with most things, letting it settle into its proper place before deciding what to do with it. Then he said quietly, "I almost walked out." "I know," Carson said. "That's why I didn't give you time to think about it." They stood together in the backstage corridor for another moment. Two men who had spent their lives being watched, sharing something that no camera had caught. Neither of them said anything more. Neither needed to. What neither of them understood in that moment was that the conversation they had just had in private would outlast almost everything else they had done in public. Eastwood never hid the piano again. Not completely. Not the way he had before that Tuesday night in Burbank. He didn't announce it to the world or give interviews about his musical life. That wasn't his nature. But the wall he had kept around it came down quietly and permanently, the way walls do when the thing they were protecting has already been seen. He began composing his own film scores, not hiring composers and overseeing them from a distance, but sitting down himself and building the music from the inside out, the same way he had built that jazz piece no one had heard for 20 years. The scores he created carried the same quality as that night on The Tonight Show. Restrained, melancholic, built on space as much as sound. Critics called it a remarkable late development in his career. Eastwood knew it wasn't late. It had always been there. Carson had simply refused to let it stay hidden. Carson, for his part, never ran that particular play again. He had spent 3 decades finding the real person beneath the public image in guests who sat across from his desk. He had a gift for it. But something about the night with Eastwood had reached its natural limit. He had found what he was looking for. There was nothing left to prove. In the years after Carson retired in 1992, he disappeared almost completely from public life. He turned away reporters, declined invitations, and let the silence speak for him the way silence always had. Very few people were allowed through the door. Eastwood was one of them. They met privately, without cameras, without audiences. Two men who understood each other's particular kind of loneliness. Years later, a journalist asked Eastwood about the greatest performance of his life. He didn't answer immediately, and he didn't name a film. 30 seconds on a piano, Eastwood said, in front of 15 million people, with nothing to hide behind. That was his answer. Not Unforgiven, not Dirty Harry, not the Dollars trilogy, or the decades of films that had made him one of the most recognized faces on earth. The greatest performance of his life was the one he almost didn't give, the one that lasted 30 seconds and cost him everything he had spent a lifetime protecting. After Carson died in January of 2005, Eastwood spoke about him publicly in the way that private men speak about private losses, carefully, with long spaces between the words. He called Carson the standard that no one had matched, not as a host, not as a performer, but as a man who understood that the most powerful thing you could do for another person was refuse to let them stay hidden when hiding was hurting them. Carson never knew what that dare had unlocked. He didn't live to see the film scores, the jazz recordings, the piano that Eastwood kept in every home he ever owned, but he heard it first. In 7 seconds, behind a desk in Burbank, while 15 million people held their breath without knowing why. Every person carries something like that piano. A truth they have practiced alone for years. A room they keep locked because they are afraid that opening it will make everything else smaller. It never does. The real things always make everything larger. That is the only standard that has ever mattered.